Imagine spending hours crafting the perfect snowman, only to have it destroyed again and again by your nightmare neighbor. But what if, this time, the snowman fought back? Want to find out how the snowman struck back? Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for the full story. Winter had always been my favorite time of year. There was something magical about the crisp air, the way the world seemed to slow down under a blanket of snow, and of course, the tradition that had become my personal mark on the neighborhood, building an epic snowman. But not just any snowman. My creations were legendary. One year, I sculpted a full-size snow wizard, complete with a frozen staff. Another time, I built a Viking snowman, battle-ready with a shield and sword made of ice. My snowmen weren't just fun for me. They became a spectacle for the entire neighborhood. Families would stop by to take pictures, kids would marvel at the details, and my neighbors would often compliment my work. It was one of those rare things that made our little suburb feel like a real community, something that brought people together, even if just for a season. But not everyone appreciated my annual masterpieces. Enter Eleanor. Eleanor was the self-appointed queen of our street, the kind of neighbor who thrived on finding problems where there were none. Every neighborhood has one, a person who takes it upon themselves to enforce imaginary rules, send passive-aggressive emails, and pretend to wield authority they don't actually have. In our case, that was Eleanor, the leader of what she claimed was the neighborhood HOA. Except, there was no HOA. Years ago, before I even moved in, the community had voted against forming one. But Eleanor wasn't one to take no for an answer. Instead of accepting the decision, she created her own fake HOA. She printed out official-looking documents, mailed out bogus violation notices, and even convinced some of the newer residents to pay her monthly fees. Most people ignored her, recognizing her power trip for what it was. But some, unfortunately, fell for her scam, afraid of fines or legal trouble. I had managed to avoid her nonsense for the most part. Sure, I had received a few official warnings about my non-compliant lawn height and my unauthorized holiday decorations, but I ignored them like everyone else did. As far as I was concerned, Eleanor was just a minor inconvenience, a neighborhood joke. Until she came for my snowman. The morning after I had proudly completed my latest snowman masterpiece, I stepped outside to admire my work, only to find a pile of slush and scattered snow chunks where my creation had stood the night before. At first, I assumed it had been the work of mischievous kids or maybe even an unlucky accident. But something about the destruction seemed deliberate. The snowman wasn't just knocked over, it had been stomped, kicked, and smashed into the ground. My curiosity turned into disbelief when I checked my security camera footage. There, clear as day, was Eleanor, sneaking onto my property in her bathrobe and slippers at nearly midnight. With the determination of a woman possessed, she marched straight to my snowman, raised her foot, and kicked its head clean off like she was taking a penalty shot. She didn't stop there. She ripped off its stick arms, stomped the body into the ground, and, as if that wasn't enough, pulled out a hairdryer from her pocket and started melting the remains. I stared at the screen in shock, then in disbelief, then in pure rage. Who in their right mind does this? I stormed outside, half expecting to see some kind of emergency note or even an apology taped to my door. But instead, I found something even more ridiculous, a letter from Eleanor, taped to my mailbox. Dear homeowner, as per HOA regulations, all unauthorized yard decorations must be removed within 24 hours. Failure to comply may result in fines. Sincerely, Eleanor, HOA President. I clenched my fist as I read it. There were two problems with this letter. 1. There was no HOA. 2. It wasn't a request. It was a threat. Eleanor wasn't just being a petty neighbor. She was on a power trip, and now she had turned her sights on me. Furious, I took the letter and marched straight to her house. She lived just 2 streets over, and when I rang the doorbell, she opened it almost instantly, as if she had been expecting me. There she was, standing in her doorway, wearing a robe embroidered with HOA Queen and gold lettering, sipping a steaming mug of coffee like she was some kind of dictator overseeing her kingdom. I knew you'd come, she said smugly, taking a sip. I was wondering how long it would take. I held up the letter. You want to explain this? She barely glanced at it, waving a hand dismissively. That's a legally binding violation notice. I actually laughed. Legally binding? Eleanor, there is no HOA. That's where you're wrong, she said, tilting her head condescendingly. The HOA exists whether you like it or not. I've lived here for 10 years, I shot back. I was at the meeting where we voted against forming an HOA. Her fake smile didn't even waver. And I was at the meeting where we reconsidered. I narrowed my eyes. Who exactly voted? She waved vaguely. That's not important. The point is, you are in violation, and there will be consequences. I took a deep breath, my grip tightening on the letter. Let's say, for argument's sake, that this imaginary HOA was real. What exactly am I violating? She smirked. Excessive yard decorations. I blinked. It's a snowman. Yes, she said, nodding as if I had finally understood. A yard decoration. In winter. Yes. In a state that gets snow. Yes. I stared at her in disbelief. It's literally made of snow. It is temporary. That's not the point, she snapped. It's an eyesore. If you don't remove it, you'll be fined $75 per day until it's gone. That's when I decided Eleanor wanted a fight. She was going to get one. If Eleanor wanted a battle, I was ready to give her one. I wasn't just going to rebuild my snowman. I was going to make sure it was indestructible. I started with a trip to the hardware store, looking for something that would hold up against Eleanor's inevitable next attack. That's when I saw it, a steel drum. Big, heavy, and nearly indestructible, the perfect core for my revenge masterpiece. I bought it on the spot, along with a bag of quick-dry cement. If Eleanor wanted to escalate, I was about to meet her at the top of the crazy ladder. Back at home, I got to work. Step 1. I filled the steel drum with cement, letting it set into a solid, immovable block. That alone would have been enough to stop Eleanor's shovel, but I wasn't done. Step 2. I packed snow and ice tightly around the barrel, sculpting it into a snowman's body. I smoothed out the surface, making it look as innocent and inviting as ever. Step 3. I sprayed a fine layer of water over the entire structure, letting it freeze into a smooth, near-invisible shell of ice. The result? A 300-pound frozen fortress. But I still had one more trick up my sleeve. I had seen Eleanor's tactics before. If she really wanted to get rid of my snowman, she wouldn't stop at a shovel. She had used her SUV before to nudge things she didn't like out of the way, trash cans, mailboxes, even a kid's bike once. So, for my final touch, I placed a few strategically positioned bricks inside the base of my snowman. Nothing visible, just enough to make sure that if she rammed it, she'd get a nasty surprise. I stood back and admired my work. From the street, it looked completely harmless, just another winter decoration. But beneath the surface, it was a fortress. I set up my security cameras, made myself a hot chocolate, and waited. She had no idea what was coming. It didn't take long. That night, as soon as the sun set, I saw Eleanor's SUV creeping down the street. I watched from my window as she slowed in front of my yard. Her headlights flooded the snowman, and I could practically feel her seething. For a moment, she just sat there, as if debating whether or not to engage in another round of destruction. But then, she pulled into my driveway. I knew exactly what was coming. She stepped out of her car, a brand new shovel in her hands. With an air of righteous indignation, she stormed across my yard and swung at the snowman with all her strength. Clang. The impact reverberated through the air as the shovel bounced off the solid core. Eleanor stumbled back, shaking her hands in pain, realizing something was very wrong. She leaned in, inspecting the snowman. Maybe she noticed the ice shell, or maybe she felt the resistance when she tried to jab at it. Either way, she took a step back, pulled out her phone, and made a call. A few minutes later, I heard the rumble of an engine. She was bringing in reinforcements. I watched as she climbed back into her SUV. Her headlights flashed as she positioned her vehicle directly in front of my snowman. I could practically see the gears turning in her head. She had done this before, lightly bumping objects she wanted gone. But this time, she had no idea what she was in for. She revved the engine, hesitated, then she floored it. Boom. The impact was glorious. Her front bumper crunched inward like an accordion. The hood crumpled. The headlights flickered. The unmistakable sound of a radiator exploding echoed through the street. Steam billowed from under the hood, and the snowman didn't move an inch. Eleanor stumbled out of her car, staring at the damage in shock. I casually stepped outside, leaning against my doorframe, hot chocolate in hand. Something wrong, Eleanor? She spun to face me, face twisted in rage, but before she could answer, the police arrived. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the wrecked SUV and the perfectly intact snowman. I took another sip of cocoa. This was going to be fun. As the patrol car pulled up, the scene was nothing short of cinematic. Eleanor, standing in front of her wrecked SUV, staring in disbelief at the completely unscathed snowman, while I stood on my porch, sipping hot chocolate. Officer Mitchell, A man who had clearly seen too much nonsense in his career stepped out of his car and rubbed his temples before speaking. "Ma'am," he sighed. "Do you want to explain what happened here?" Eleanor, still in shock, seemed to struggle with words. Finally, she pointed at me. He set me up," she screeched. "He booby-trapped his yard." Mitchell raised an eyebrow and turned to me. "Sir." I took a slow sip of my cocoa and shrugged. "It's just a snowman, officer." Mitchell pinched the bridge of his nose. "So let me get this straight. You, ma'am, intentionally drove your SUV onto his private property and hit a stationary object?" "It was a trap," Eleanor insisted, her face turning red. "He put concrete inside the snowman." "That's illegal." Mitchell turned back to me. "Sir, did you put concrete in your snowman?" I smiled. "Of course not. I just made it extra sturdy this time since someone kept knocking it over." I gestured toward my security camera, which was aimed directly at the yard. "You're welcome to check the footage." Officer Mitchell sighed again. "Yeah, I think I'd like to do that." Eleanor's face paled. "Wait, that's not necessary." But it was too late. Within minutes, Mitchell and his partner were watching the entire saga on my security footage. Eleanor sneaking onto my lawn, attacking my snowman multiple times, and finally, deliberately ramming her SUV into it. Mitchell turned back to Eleanor. "Ma'am, I have to ask, what exactly was your plan here?" She sputtered. I was enforcing the HOA rules." Mitchell frowned. "The same HOA that doesn't exist?" Eleanor's mouth snapped shut so fast I thought she might crack a tooth. Mitchell exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Daniels, who had been quietly taking notes. Daniels finally spoke up. "Ma'am, we've received multiple reports about you issuing fake HOA fines and demanding money from residents." Eleanor's eyes widened. I don't know what you're talking about." Mitchell crossed his arms. "Funny, because we were already looking into these reports before tonight. And now, we have video evidence of trespassing, property damage, reckless driving, and possible fraud." Eleanor's face turned an impressive shade of pale. "And," Mitchell continued, "since you intentionally drove onto private property, your insurance isn't going to cover the damage to your car. You'll be paying for those repairs yourself." Eleanor let out a strangled noise somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Daniels tapped his notepad. "Now let's talk about that fake HOA of yours." That was the moment Eleanor truly realized she was in deep trouble. I stood there, watching the scene unfold, basking in the glow of sweet, sweet justice. My snowman, still standing tall and undefeated, had done its job. The investigation was just beginning, and things were only going to get worse for Eleanor. And honestly, I was going to enjoy every second of it. By the next morning, Eleanor was back at it again. This time, she had taped a brand new letter to every mailbox in the neighborhood. Mandatory community reimbursement notice. Due to the unexpected damages sustained by the HOA president's vehicle, all households are required to contribute a one-time emergency fee of $300. Failure to comply will result in additional fines and penalties. Eleanor, HOA president. I had to sit down. I was laughing so hard I could barely breathe. Eleanor had crashed her own car into my snowman and was now trying to force the neighborhood to pay for it. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. I wasn't the only one who found this hilarious. Within hours, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with outrage. People were calling each other, comparing notes, and laughing at Eleanor's latest stunt. Some of my neighbors took it upon themselves to gather at her house, demanding an explanation. And that's when we struck back. A small group of us, led by my neighbor Mike, called the city council and local law enforcement. Within hours, an official investigator was at Eleanor's door. And, as it turned out, Eleanor had made a critical mistake. See, up until now, her HOA scam had been annoying but mostly under the radar. But this time, she had gone too far, demanding money from the entire neighborhood in writing. That meant evidence of fraud, and the authorities took it very seriously. Later that evening, a city official made an announcement in the neighborhood Facebook group. "Attention residents. There is no legal HOA governing this community. If you have made any payments to Eleanor's fraudulent HOA, please contact local law enforcement." An official investigation is now underway. The floodgates opened. Dozens of people came forward with evidence. Bogus fines, fake HOA documents, even Venmo payments Eleanor had received. It turned out she had scammed thousands of dollars from unsuspecting homeowners over the years. The the final nail in the coffin? The police and financial fraud investigators showed up at her house less than 24 hours later. I stood on my porch, sipping coffee, watching as they walked up to her front door. Eleanor tried to argue, tried to bluff her way out of it, but it was over. The evidence was overwhelming. She was facing charges of fraud, tax evasion, and harassment. And the best part? She had to put her house up for sale to pay back the money she had scammed from the neighborhood. By the end of the month, Eleanor was gone. Her house was sold at auction. Her fake HOA empire had crumbled, and peace was restored to the neighborhood. And my snowman? It stood tall the entire winter, a monument to Eleanor's downfall. Lessons learned. This story teaches us a powerful lesson about resilience, justice, and standing up against bullies. Eleanor believed she could control people through intimidation and deception, but in the end, truth and persistence prevailed. When dealing with unfair situations, it's important to stay calm, gather evidence, and let justice take its course. Meaningful message. This isn't just a funny story about a snowman. It's a testament to the idea that doing the right thing will always win in the long run. No matter how many obstacles you face, integrity, patience, and smart planning will always lead to victory. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply standing your ground and letting the truth work in your favor. Personal perspective. From my own perspective, this experience was more than just a neighborhood feud. It was a reminder that people like Eleanor thrive on fear and control. But when a community comes together, when people refuse to be bullied, even the most persistent tyrant can be defeated. And let's be honest, watching her drive into a reinforced snowman was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more crazy, entertaining, and meaningful tales, make sure to subscribe to Story Precious. Hit the like button, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more unforgettable stories. You won't want to miss what's coming next.